Hi, I'm Justy. Welcome back to The Skeptheist, an ongoing series of videos where we discuss concepts of Igtheism and Skepticism. Who am I? That's irrelevant to today's discussion, but if you're interested, here's the sort of thing I like to do.
Check this out!
Fuck! Now that's out of the way, let's talk a bit about homeopathy and some logical fallacies we can identify that are associated with it. See The Skeptheist Episode 1 if you need a definition of skepticism and or Igtheism. Homeopathy is wonderful because it provides a mishmash of varied and interconnected logical fallacies that we can use to improve our skeptical thinking. So rather than give an abstract and general definition of these fallacies, which you can find here, I'll give them based on homeopathy itself. So in other words, using homeopathy as an example of these logical fallacies. What's a logical fallacy? A logical fallacy is an offence to logic. It's pretty clear that most people aren't aware of logical fallacies. I think this is a very important topic to discuss in skepticism. Homeopathy is an 18th century pre-scientific medicinal modality, the essential claim of which is the more one dilutes a substance, the more powerful it becomes. And right off the bat, of course, one's alarm bells ring because that runs counter to everything else that's been discovered in science about the strength of medicines. One of the proposed mechanisms by homeopaths for this property of increased potency based on increased dilution is that water has a memory. One aspect of the history of homeopathy which I found particularly interesting was that at the time it was developed, it actually was much better for your health to have nothing but water versus some of the other tonics that were being pushed at the time. For example, metals and minerals and other things which we now know, of course, are highly poisonous. There are at least 5 logical fallacies that I can associate with homeopathy. There may be more, and please leave comments if you can identify more. The first that comes to mind is the moving goalpost. Science can construct experiments to determine the efficacy of homeopathy, and time again it shows that it has no efficacy and has no plausible mechanism. And the counterclaim, which contains the logical fallacy of moving the goalpost, is that the experiments aren't right. The experiments need to be made more finely tuned. So that's the moving goalpost fallacy. So the next logical fallacy is the argument ad ignorantium. This fallacy, as it relates to homeopathy, is essentially homeopathy works because we can't prove it doesn't work. Now that also includes a false premise because science has proven that homeopathy has neither a plausible mechanism with which to operate nor any medical efficacy. The other, and this is a biggie, is confusing correlation with causation. So for example, I had a cold, I took some homeopathic remedies, and a short time later, I was cured. My own hypothesis for why people do this all the time is that we've had millions of years of conditioning to it. For example, we see a flash of lightning in the sky, a short time later, we hear thunder, and we conclude quite correctly that one caused the other. However, it is a logical fallacy to claim this generally. In other words, to claim that just because B followed A caused B. It's easy to see how the human species has developed this propensity to commit logical fallacies. A logically incorrect heuristic way of responding to something may have a higher survival value than sitting there and pondering whether it's correct or not. But that's no reason to keep committing them. That would be a logical fallacy of its own, which we will cover. Another one might be the fallacy of logical inconsistency. And one example of this in homeopathy is that the claim is made that water has a memory, and that's the mechanism by which the efficacy of homeopathy is achieved. And on the other hand, we know that water touches all sorts of yucky things. Every time you flush your toilet, you are sending a homeopathic remedy on its way. And even the most staunch homeopathist wouldn't be prepared to admit that you are having the essence of feces in your homeopathic remedy, even though by their other claim, the first logical claim, that is true. So these logical fallacies highlight another issue which I think is quite interesting, and that is, despite the wide and eclectic variety of people's beliefs, I would say that most people have an internal logic. Now, that internal logic need not be internally consistent. It need also not be formally identified by the possessor of that logic. In other words, I can formally identify the logical, the symbolic level of logic that I'm using when I'm making a statement. I can talk about valid arguments and sound arguments and logical premises, but there's no need for that to have an internal logic. Most people, I would imagine, if they saw smoke billowing out of an aeroplane, would not get on the aeroplane. They correctly conclude that where there is smoke, and I mean actual smoke, not metaphorical smoke, there is actual fire. and fire implies danger, and danger implies a threat to existence, and the threat to existence is, for people of sound mind, a very prime motivator to do something about the situation, i.e. avoid the situation, control the situation, and so forth. And so they're using an internal logic to crunch through these potential consequences of their actions. So don't get on the burning plane, otherwise something bad will happen. So to give a homeopathic example, if you took somebody of sound mind who'd just been on a 20-kilometre run, down in front of 2 glasses of water, and in front of their eyes poured in huge quantities of salt into one of the glasses, it's a bit of a no-brainer to work out which glass they'd prefer to drink. They know that the more salt you add to water, the saltier it becomes, and they've seen you pour a large amount of salt, not a pinch, a huge amount, like half the glass, let's just say. So they know that it's very, very salty water. Which glass would they drink? It's pretty obvious they drink the clean glass. And so right there, they've crunched through some logic. Salty water is yucky, I don't want to have something yucky, I won't drink it. And yet, and this is where the inconsistency and hypocrisy comes into it, they're also simultaneously prepared to believe that the more a substance is diluted, the more potent it becomes. So we could have a semantic debate here about potency and efficacy, and saltiness isn't potency, it's just saltiness, for example. I think those debates are a distraction from the real point, which is that substances are substances, and the more of them we have, the greater that effect of that substance is. I mean, would the homeopaths be prepared to accept that if we extracted all of the air out of a room, then the potency of that air would increase and they'd be able to breathe? Of course they wouldn't. So this is where the hypocrisy and the logical inconsistency comes in. Another fallacy that relates to homeopathy is that of investment. In other words, I've invested 20 years of my life in homeopathy. I've invested a great amount of my own credibility by stating that I believe it works and spreading that meme to other people. So therefore it better be true, otherwise I've wasted my life, essentially. And this is a reasoning that occurs, I think, perhaps at a lower level. People don't actually consciously reason this way. It's easy to see why people commit this all the time. It's just human nature to want to believe that we've been right all along, to not look like a fool after all this time. That's why I encourage an installation of the skeptical mindset at an early age. One absolutely plausible mechanism of homeopathy is the placebo effect, but it's not a mechanism that pertains exclusively to homeopathy. Now, in the interest of full disclosure and intellectual honesty, I have a confession to make. I have believed things in the past and have let go of those beliefs, and I'll talk more about that later, but one thing I've never believed in is homeopathy. But the confession is that about a year ago, my partner and I did use homeopathic remedies to allay my son's teething issues. And I knew full well that there's nothing to homeopathy, but I also knew full well that the placebo effect is incredibly powerful, even in 1-year-olds. And indeed, it was very effective. One time we were without our homeopathic remedies, and I had to improvise, and so I just flaked off a couple of bits of rice biscuit and used that instead. And the effect was exactly the same. Now, many have claimed homeopathy, there's nothing in it, and I fully support that claim. The claim I'd like to make is homeopathy, it's chock full of placebo-y goodness. The final thing I'd like to talk about today is homeopathy. What's the harm? If homeopathy is ineffective and there's nothing to it and it's just lolly water, what's the harm in taking it? Well, the harm is, of course, that it dilutes, if you'll pardon the pun, the perceived efficacy of legitimate medicines in pharmacies, and that is, I believe, a concern. Well, the harm is that it continues to promote something that is simply not true. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's short discussion about homeopathy and the logical fallacies associated with it. God, I'm tired. I want to sleep. I can't sleep, darling. I must keep going. Parents, have you installed the Skeptical Mindset Toolkit into your child yet? If not, you better hurry up, because it's a bit like vaccines. Put it off too long, and there'll be no end to the woo.